Our first panel is life cycle assessments and environmental impacts. And we have several speakers, and I will introduce each one by reading a short bio. We'll have their presentation, and then please, if you have questions and comments, you can use the chat box, and we'll moderate the conversation based on the comments and questions that we're getting, and people can also speak live when that's possible. So our first speaker for this panel is Valentin Faust. His presentation is titled N2O Emissions and Carbon Footprint of a Urine Treatment and Fertilizer Production System. Valentin did his master in environmental engineering at ETH Zurich in Switzerland, with majors in urban water management and water resource management. In 2018, Faust started his PhD at EWAG, supervised by Professor Kayem Udert, focusing on partial urine nitrification. The PhD is part of ESA's MELISSA program, which stands for Microecological Life Support System Alternative. And is co-supervised by Professor Ramon Ganigué and Professor Siegfried E. Vlamink from University of Antwerp. Welcome, Valentin, and it's all yours.
So yeah, thank you for the introduction. It's an honor to open this session. Today, I'm going to be mostly talking about N2O emission during biological urine treatment. As you might have already heard in the last 2 days, combining the partial nitrification, granular activated carbon filtration, and distillation is a well-established approach to convert urine into ammonium nitrate fertilizer. And as we know, fertilizer production from source-separated urine can partly substitute industrial fertilizer and is in line with circular economy. However, to evaluate how environmentally sustainable a technology is, among others, its operational carbon footprint has to be estimated. And from wastewater treatment plant, we basically know that N2O emission from biological nitrogen conversion can strongly contribute to the operational carbon footprint. So what are the N2O emissions during biological urine treatment, and how do they relate to the overall carbon footprint? Now, given the strong dependence of N2O emission on process condition and on reactor configuration, it is extremely difficult to extrapolate N2O emission based on the report of a different treatment system. Therefore, in this study, we try to determine the N2O emission of the presented system ourselves, determine key factors and propose mitigation strategies, and compare the N2O emission to the overall carbon footprint of the system. Now, to be honest, going into this, I was a little bit afraid of finding very high N2O emission, because this can be a huge deal breaker for new technology. But let's see. Now, first, we measured N2O, the N2O emission from the nitrification reactor. Therefore, the N2O concentration in the off gas of a 120 liter urine nitrification reactor at EWAG was monitored continuously during 1 month with a non-dispersive infrared sensor. The nitrification reactor was operated as fed batch, meaning that there was a aerated phase with a pH-controlled feeding strategy. Once the maximum fill level was reached, there was a settling phase without airflow, followed by a decant phase of roughly 10% reactor volume, before the reactor is, of course, re-aerated and the cycle start again. During the measurement campaign, we tried to cover different operation conditions in terms of pH, dissolved oxygen, nitrite, and settling duration. Now, let's have a look at the N2O emission. In red, you can see the N2O emission per fed batch cycle expressed relative to the total nitrogen load in the inflow. So every dot corresponds to 1 fed batch cycle. In gray, you have the settling and decant duration. The N2O emission factor ranged from 0.4 to 1.2% of the nitrogen load, with an average of 0.7% of the whole measurement campaign. This actually falls well within the range of stream nitrification, which usually have emission factor between 0.1 and 2%. So that was already rather good news. But how can we mitigate the emission further. On day 5, you see it here, the cycling time was temporarily reduced by 50%, while all other operational variables remain constant. The shorter unrated phase led to a significant reduction of N2O emission. From day 30 onward, here, the settling time was permanently reduced, leading again to a drop in N2O emission. Why does this happen? For this, let's zoom in to a fat patch cycle. So here you see 2 fat patch cycles. The aerated phase is in yellow and the cycling and decant phase in blue. The green and the red lines here are the N2O loads for 2 different settling times, for 30 minutes in green and 50 minutes in red. And you can see that always, like really always, a dominant peak in N2O emission occurred at the beginning of the aeration phase. And this peak accounted for up to 80% of the total emission during a fat patch cycle. Within less than 1 hour, the N2O emission returned to the level it had prior to the settling phase. And if we compare the 2 settling time and 2 settling duration, we can clearly see that a shorter settling time led to a smaller N2O peak and therefore also to lower N2O emission for the whole fat patch cycle. So presumably what is happening here, N2O is produced under oxygen limiting or anoxic condition and stripped when the nitrification reactor is re-aerated. So we can clearly state as a first mitigation measure that phases with very low or no dissolved oxygen should be avoided. In our case, this means to minimize the settling phase or change to a system without settling phase, such as a membrane bioreactor. But the cycling time alone cannot explain the fluctuation in N2O. You can see that here. To further investigate the key factors, we separated the N2O peak, so this peak here, from the rest of the fat patch cycle and only focused on this second part. It looks small, but it still accounts for a big share of the N2O emission. So in red, again, the continuous N2O load, but this time without this peak. So this peak was like the first hour of the fat patch cycle was always removed, and this is kind of the fully aerated phase. The black triangles are the nitrite concentration grab samples, and the gray line is coming from an electrochemical nitrite sensor, which allowed online nitrite measurement. And you can see it here, the nitrite and the N2O have a very familiar pattern with a Pearson correlation coefficient of 0.8. And basically a strong increase in nitrite always went along with an increase in N2O emission, meaning that keeping the nitrite concentration low, let's say below 5 milligram N per liter, should be beneficial in terms of N2O. Now, we originally wanted to stop here because we thought, let's look at the nitrification, but the high impact of the unaerated phase made us suspicious because following the nitrification, we actually have very long anoxic phases in the intermediate tanks and in the granular activated carbon filter. We don't have airflow, so the N2O is not stripped directly, but all the dissolved N2O produced during those stages would be emitted the latest during the distillation process. So it's still a problem and it should be accounted for. That is why we measured the dissolved concentration at these sampling points with headspace gas chromatography. Here you can see the grab samples which we took from the intermediate storage tank between the nitrification and the granular activated carbon filtration. So first thing to notice is that the N2O concentration are considerably high. It's again, as before, like the emission factors. So it's higher than what we already had emitted in the nitrification. So that was, of course, bad news. Lots of N2O is always bad news. But we can also see that the N2O concentration are kind of fluctuating. During periods with lower hydraulic retention time in the storage tank, we observed lower concentration. And those grab samples were actually taken during a period with comparably low flow rates due to limiting fresh urine availability, which was COVID related. To obtain a representative emission factor for the main measurement campaign, so that the one with the nitrification, the N2O concentration was estimated using the linear relationship between the N2O concentration and the hydraulic residence time, which resulted in an emission factor for the intermediate storage of 0.8%. And we were also able to show that no N2O was produced once the liquid once the nitrified urine has passed the granular activated carbon filtration, most likely because there was no organics and no active biomass anymore, which is both necessary for N2O formation, biological N2O formation. So we can state as next mitigation measure that intermediate storage between nitrification and granular activated carbon filtration has to be avoided. For the whole urine treatment chain, the N2O emission factor adds up to 1.5% of total nitrogen load. Now, how much is this compared to the carbon footprint of the whole system? Overall, the N2O emission, here the base case, accounted for 45% of the operation carbon footprint using a European energy mix. The biggest share is still actually coming from the distillation process, which we already heard mentioned in the last 2 days a few times. Applying the proposed N2O mitigation strategies, which I had on my slides, and also using a green energy mix, also had a big impact, could potentially lower the carbon footprint significantly down to 1.5 kilogram CO2 equivalent per kilogram nitrogen. So to conclude, N2O emission from biological urine treatment are in the same range as for wastewater treatment, but can strongly be mitigated by avoiding phases with low or no oxygen and high nitrite concentration. The carbon footprint of the whole system is mainly caused by the energy consumption of the distiller, but also by the direct N2O emission. So it's worth to invest in those mitigation strategies. So I actually hope that someone will take those numbers derived in this study and use it as a full life cycle assessment for urine treatment and fertilizer production. And that's all from my side. Big thank you for the people organizing the summit. It's really great to be here, and big thank you to all of you for your attention. And feel free to ask questions in the chat or whenever you want.
Thank you so much, Valentin, for kicking things off this morning with an excellent presentation. Comments, questions in the chat right now are good. We plan to have time after all the presentations for some more kind of spoken out loud interactions. So to keep us moving along, I will introduce our next speaker, Dr. Nancy Love, whose presentation is titled Lifecycle Assessment of Urine Diversion and Conversion to Fertilizer Products at the City Scale. Dr. Love is the principal investigator of the National Science Foundation's Infuse project, advancing technologies and improving communication of urine-derived fertilizers for food production within a risk-based framework. Dr. Love is the Borchardt and Glisson Collegiate Professor of Civil and Environmental Engineering at the University of Michigan and an adjunct professor at the Institute of Biotechnology at Addis Ababa University. In collaboration with her students, Dr. Love works at the interface of water, infrastructure, and public health in both domestic and global settings. I tried to memorize all of that, but I just didn't quite have the time, so I had to read that. Nancy, take it away. Thanks for being here.
Can you all see my screen at this point?
Not at the present moment.
This is really a weird, hold on a second. Oh, share. I guess I should hit share. That would help. It was doing a weird thing. Now let me do it.
Okay, something's coming up. There we go.
It's better to me. Okay, right. Okay. Thanks very much, Ivan. I really appreciate it. And I just have to say that I'm so impressed with Rich Earth's, bringing us together again and just seeing the growth of this this gathering, this summit. It's really inspiring, and it every year makes me dig in and think, okay, let's keep moving this forward. So I'm grateful to be able to chat with you all today about some of the work that was done as part of our Infuse grant, and also to be part of this summit for these 3 days. during our project, one of the efforts that so generally, our project had multiple facets, and I've talked about it at the past for those of you who've been here before. We've really looked at trying to think of it at the system scale as part of our work. We're right now undergoing a risk analysis comparative between urine-derived fertilizers and other forms of kind of irrigation to crops, and looking at kind of the pharmaceutical impact to help with the discussions and conversations around how urine-derived fertilizers can reduce risk, getting back to that perception that we talked about on day one. But during the beginning of the project and last year, we actually, earlier this year, I think maybe it was late last year, we published this work on life cycle assessment. I need to just mention that this was work done by Stephen Hilton, who has graduated. He was in our School of Environment and Sustainability. He was advised by Greg Keolian. And so this is really the work of Stephen and Greg. Glenn Diger, myself, and Bowen Zhao all supported it. And so if there are deep questions about this, I may have to get back to some of you, because there are a lot of pieces and moving parts to this. But to give you kind of a sense, we looked at 2 different processing trains for urine separation, collection, processing, and then production of urine fertilizer. One of those trains was just the notion of urine concentration. I'll tell you more about them in just a minute. The other was a struvite precipitation to capture the phosphorus, and then an ammonium sulfate production using an ion exchange process that Will Tarpe, who's now at Stanford, had been working on. And we compared those to the conventional state, which is no urine separation, and using conventional centralized wastewater treatment. And we did this in 3 different states. And so I'll show you that, because the wastewater treatment, the conventional treatment used in different states, is quite different in terms of the LCA that would come out of it. And so let me get here. So our approach, though, as well, this assumes a built-out system. So, as an engineer and one works in the water industry, when we design these wastewater systems, we're designing them, for 40 years out or 50 years out. So if we want to see this reality of urine separation as part of our overall circular economy, hopefully, that we're headed to, we need to be designing this stuff now to see it in 2050, 2060. So we really ran that scenario. And so the assumptions and the approach used here is we compared the operational phase of 2 different urine collection and processing treatment streams versus large-scale centralized conventional wastewater treatment in 3 regions of the United States that have different effluent requirements and different electricity grid fuel kind of mixtures that are used to run those systems. We assumed a built-out urine separation system such that 70% of the population in each of these scenarios was actually utilizing urine separation in the cases when we consider that. And we evaluate the life cycle of the LCA with assuming the treatment of 1 person's equivalent of wastewater for 1 year. We use conventional LCA methodologies, using US Lifecycle inventory and EcoInvent when we didn't have information coming out of the former. And I'm going to emphasize some of the environmental impact elements: the global warming potential, the cumulative energy demand, freshwater use, eutrophication potential, and acidification potential. So let me walk through each of these scenarios. So the first scenario is what we call conventional, and it's designated as C in the results that I'll show you. In this case, there's no urine separation. And the life cycle assessment starts by considering the potable water, its production and distribution that is used for flushing. So we only consider that part of the potable water that is actually used for flushing, collected in the household, and then moving on through the treatment plant, conveyed to the treatment plant, and then going through the different steps of preliminary, primary, secondary treatment, disinfection. There's sludge treatment, sludge management, And then we have to compare the fertilizer production. It would be conventional fertilizer production. So it's mining, it's Haber-Bosch, et cetera, for fertilizer. And in this case, we assume long haul so that the fertilizer that's produced is actually going long distances to its final endpoint. It turns out the yellowed boxes indicate those steps in this LCA process that are different between the different scenarios. So all the scenarios, preliminary and primary treatment, are not different in terms of their environmental impacts, whether you are doing urine separation or not, because we're not removing nitrogen or phosphorus or potassium in those steps or utilizing them, and similar assumption on disinfection. The struvite and ammonium sulfate stage is, again, we have the household potable water production, but the flushing now we're either capturing 70% of the urine or sending the rest 30% plus the black water and gray water to the centralized treatment system. Similar approach here in terms of primary, secondary, disinfection, sludge handling, and so forth. But now we have our struvite precipitation. We do not have a separate step for pharmaceutical removal in this because we're using ion exchange. And so we get our phosphorus out here. We use our ion exchange to selectively capture the ammonium using magnesium oxide in the struvite precipitation, by the way. And then there's an acid regeneration of the ion exchange so it can be reused. And then we assume regional distribution of the fertilizer that is produced as opposed to long haul. And then for the urine concentration, kind of similar on the 30% of urine not captured plus the black water, gray water. But now we're going to actually use an activated carbon step to remove pharmaceuticals. And we're going to regenerate that activated carbon. Then we have concentration and pasteurization. In this case, concentration is performed by reverse osmosis. So early in our project, that's what we were using before we went to the freeze concentration that Abe told you about. And then pasteurization and fertilizer distribution. So we applied those three scenarios in three different locations around the United States that have very different treatment approaches, different effluent guidelines, and different power grid scenarios. So those are Virginia, Vermont, and Michigan. So Virginia, we assumed a densely populated urban area, population given here, with very stringent effluent guidelines. So Virginia, we're assuming over on the Chesapeake Bay side, some of the highest most stringent guidelines in the United States, and some of the most advanced treatment plants in the world are located there. We used what's called an advanced secondary 5-stage Bardenfo. So this is a system that uses biological approaches to remove phosphorus and nitrogen and carbon. In Vermont, the effluent requirements in both Vermont and Michigan are much less stringent than they are in this Virginia scenario. We assumed a small urban community in a rural state. There's no total nitrogen limits, but there's a phosphorus limit. And we consumed a conventional activated sludge technology. So much less energy intensive technology, basically. And then in the state of Michigan, we looked at kind of a range of things and in terms of like the size of the treatment plants. We have Detroit's the third largest treatment plant in the world. So it's a very large system versus some of the smaller systems. So we looked at kind of a range in the state of Michigan. Variable ammonia limits and total nitrogen limits, although nowhere near what they have to do in Virginia. Slightly less restrict on phosphorus limitations. And in this case, we assume a nitrifying treatment plant that also incorporates some level of nitrogen removal, but it's not optimized. And so what we do is I'm going to show you some graphs that show you the outputs of this according to the different environmental impacts and make a few comments. So in each of these graphs, I'm showing you now global warming potential. And for each of these, you have the Virginia scenario, the Michigan scenario, and the Vermont scenario. And the bars show you outputs based upon the contribution from different parts of our processing: water production, wastewater treatment's contribution, excluding the sludge, the secondary treatment itself very specifically, the urine collection. So we remove the activated sludge and then we add that part here. So we pull that out. The urine collection contribution, so that would be in yellow. Green is the urine contribution, yellow is the urine collection. Blue is the urine-derived fertilizer production and the electricity contribution. And then there's the other is the chemicals that were used for that process. And we have transport, synthetic fertilizer, and others. And so when we are using the urine separation, we don't have synthetic fertilizer, but in the treatment ones, we assume a synthetic fertilizer production. And so you can start to compare and look and see the conventional, the C here for Michigan, Virginia, and Vermont are all larger in global warming potential than they are for the urine separation and then processing. And so this is a pattern you'll see in that generally we do see the urine separation and processing having a lower environmental impact in all but one category that I'm going to show you than the conventional treatment. The other thing you can see is differences between Michigan, Virginia, and Vermont. Michigan does tend to have the worst performance. A lot of that has to do with the fact that we have a very non-sustainable electric grid. We use mostly fossil fuels for our electricity, and the sludge is dried using a natural gas process. And so having an electric car in Michigan is not the most sustainable thing because of the way we're recharging our electric cars, unfortunately. The cumulative energy demand, so this is looking at energy demand through different means, similar pattern where we see the benefits of the different urine separation technologies. We do tend to see the urine concentration being having a little bit less environmental impact than we do the struvite and ammonium sulfate production in most of these cases. And again, the synthetic fertilizer production obviously makes quite a bit of contribution here. Similarly, again, freshwater use, we see the same thing with eutrophication potential, and then acidification potential, things change up a bit. And that is because of the use of ion exchange and the acid regeneration of the ion exchange. We get a huge environmental impact associated with that acid production for the struvite and ammonium sulfate system. So overall, urine separation is more sustainable according to these environmental impact metrics in 4 of 5 environmental impact categories. Now, I recognize that the technologies that were chosen here, they happen to be ones that we were using at that time in our field trials. And one could come in here and even bring in even less environmentally impacting technology approaches and treatment trains in order to do this kind of a comparison. So I'm just pausing there and I'm gonna leave it at that this was a large study. It's been published, and we've been able to use this though as, one of the things that I've really been focusing on is making the offset argument to centralized treatment plant utilities. So my point is that if the centralized systems focused on carbon, and not only carbon treatment, but carbon capture, and use that as kind of productive development of those systems. And then we manage our nitrogen and phosphorus and our potassium separately, and we reduce the energy demand. So here in the Great Lakes, as we're going to be seeing nitrogen regulations come into play, we're talking about billions of dollars going into more centralized treatment. We really want to prevent that from happening, and to look at these alternatives for at least part of their sewer shed as these areas grow and they need to expand their treatment plants, or in other parts of the country where that may be the case. We're actually going to be partnered in New York City, where we're going to be doing something similar to help them understand what would urine separation and processing do for New York's system, which is very landlocked and unable to really expand to more advanced treatment as their regulations become more stringent. So I'll end there and just show you some pictures from our outreach effort this past summer. On the peonies here in Ann Arbor, we have the peony gardens that thousands of people come to visit, and we actually did use, because of the pandemic, we didn't have real urine fertilizer, but we did a synthetic form on some of the beds and used it. Here's Juliana, who's one of our students who did this work, talking with people and sharing with them what is urine separation and why are we here and why is this important for the city of Ann Arbor. Thank you very much.
Terrific, Nancy. Thank you so much. Nancy and her team have been for a long time one of our major collaborators, here at Rich Earth. And, I know we're just all terribly and impressed and inspired by the work that she and her team continue to do, as well as her vision for bringing this work more to the forefront and the mainstream needs that society needs. So really glad for that presentation. We'll have a chance for questions, comments for Nancy in the chat, but we'll move on right now to our next presenter, Tristan Martin, whose presentation is titled Human Urine in Agriculture, Various Management Options Contributing to Sustainable Nitrogen Fertilization. Tristan is a postdoctoral researcher at INRAE, which is the French National Research Institute for Agriculture, Food, and Environment near Paris. He studies the agronomic potential and the environmental impacts of urine-based fertilizers. Thanks for joining us, Tristan. Take it away.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes. Okay. And can you show my screen?
We're seeing the not the presenter view yet.
Yeah. Like
There
this
we go.
normally should be okay. So I'm very happy today to present you a part of the work that I've done during my PhD that I defended last year. So I've done my PhD in the OCAPI program from with Fabien Esculier, which I've done a presentation yesterday, I think. And it's also about life cycle analysis assessment. So I wanted to put it in the context. So I work in the AgroCapi project, which aim to look how the urine-based fertilizers can meet the nitrogen need of the plant while reducing the impact of the fertilization and the wastewater management. And in the first part of this project, we look at the different treatment of urine and first of all, the characteristic of the urine-based fertilizers. After we have done agronomic trial in a greenhouse and field condition to look at the fertilizing efficiency. Some side effects such as ammonia volatilization after application. And then the aim of this part was to summarize all this into a life cycle assessment to compare the impact of using urine-based fertilizer compared to the actual practices. So we have also used the life cycle assessment method, which is a multi-criteria method which permits to take into account a lot of different impacts. And we have done the life cycle assessment of wheat production. So the production of 1 kilogram of wheat using mineral fertilizer or using urine-based fertilizers. So for the scope of the study, we wanted to take into account all the impact from the collection using diversion toilet, the treatment of urine, the transport, the storage at the farm, and then the production of grain, so 1 kilogram, to compare it with mineral fertilizers. And as we put the urine on the field instead to treat it in the wastewater treatment plants, at the level of the wastewater treatment plants, we avoid a lot of things, reactive consumption, energy. We avoid some loss to the river of nitrogen, phosphorus, and we account it as avoided impact. So we have compared 4 different scenarios. So they take place in the main farm of the Paris region, which is a region with mainly wheat, maize, big crop. And the first scenario is the reference scenario where we use mineral fertilizers, so Haber-Bosch nitrogen, fossil phosphorus. So classical it's doing today. Then for the urine-based fertilizer scenarios, we consider that we will build a new district with about 1,000 inhabitants. The first scenario is the stored urine scenarios. So there is just a diverting toilet with a pipe going into a tank in the basement of the building. And then we consider that the building, the district was 25 kilometers far from the farm. There is a storage step at the farm, and then we spread the urine. So for this urine-based fertilizer, we have to put 36 tons per hectare. And based on the ammonia volatilization experiment that we have done before, we estimated that we will lose about 7% of the nitrogen as ammonia volatilization during the application. The second scenarios is based on the work of Ervag and Vuna, and is nitrified concentrated urine. So this time there is a pipe network at the district level, and all the diverting toilets are going to a little treatment station with a nitrificator, which converts half of the nitrogen into nitrates, and a distillator, which permits to concentrate 10 times the fertilizer compared to stored urine. So that consumes energy. And then after we have the same transport distance, storage at the farm, and we only need to put a bit less than 4 tons per hectare. And as the nitrogen is under nitrate form, the volatilization is very low. And then the third scenario that we studied is based on the SLU teamwork. It's alkalinized dehydrated urine. So there is no more net for urine in the building. It's a little box installed below the toilet, filled with lime, which permit to stabilize the nitrogen under urea. And then a fan permit to evaporate the water from urine, recover solid fertilizer. So the fertilizer is 20 times more concentrated than the stored urine. We only need to put 2 tons per hectare, but we have energy consumption for the treatment. We have a bit of volatilization during the treatment, and also volatilization during the application. So with these 4 scenarios, we have calculated a lot of different impacts, and I will present you just 4 of them today. The first one is the energy demand, which is expressed as megajoule per kilogram of grain produced. So we have our 4 different scenarios, and we try to decompose the main contributor of the impact in different categories. So all what is in purple is linked to the mineral fertilizer production. In orange is the urine-based fertilizer production. In green, so there is no green in this for this category, but it's all the impact which occur at the field level. Other operation is pesticide, soil work. And in gray, we have the avoided impact at the wastewater treatment plant. And what we have to compare is the red dots and the number, which represent the balance between the positive and the negative impact. What we can see here is that the balance for stored urine is below 0, because the energy avoided, because we don't need to treat the urine at the wastewater treatment plant, compensate the positive impact. So the balance is negative and below the today's practice. So it's better for this scenario. However, for the 2 other scenarios, so nitrified urine and alkalinized urine, because of the energy consumption during the treatment, it can be higher to the actual practice. So it's not directly the numbers to take into account, but it's more the tendency, and energy may represent environmental hotspots that we should take into account when we implement a management option for urine valorization. But for mineral fertilizers, it's very optimized, centralized. There is a lot of scale effect, and the urine treatment are much more new. And I think it can be very optimized, but we have to take into account the energy. The second impact is the climate change impact in gram of CO2 per kilogram of grain. And what we can see here is that we have a big gray bar. It means that we avoid a lot of emission of greenhouse gases at the wastewater treatment plant level. It's a bit specific because we take the case of the Paris wastewater treatment plant, which emit a lot of greenhouse gases, but putting the urine into the field instead of treating it there permit to avoid all this emission, and that totally compensates the positive emission. So all the balance are negative and much lower than what we are doing today. So using urine-based fertilizers is better for the climate change than in our scenarios. And after, because we take the French electricity mix, which is mainly based on the nuclear power plant, we don't see a lot the impact of the energy consumption on the climate change. The orange bar are a bit bigger here, but not so much compared to the precedent impact categories. But it can be worse in countries with a lot of coal. The third impact is the particulate matter. So it's impact on the air quality and the health. And particulate matter is directly linked with the ammonia volatilization. So we can see that it is moderate for the mineral fertilizer and the stored urine. It is very low for nitrified urine because it's nitrate, so the volatilization is low. It's a bit higher for alkalinized urine because it's urea and the fertilizer is alkaline, so it can enhance the volatilization. And also for alkalinized urine, we have a bit of volatilization during the treatment. So when we do the sum of the two, it may be worse than the actual practices in our scenario. And so again, I think we should not take into account directly the numbers, but more the tendencies. And volatilization appear also as an environmental hotspot to take into account for the different management option. And we can also manage this problem by the application technique, etc., independently from the fertilizers. And finally, the last impact is the eutrophication, donc pollution of the water. So with our method, we take together both pollution of nitrogen and phosphorus. And what we can see is that also here, we avoid a lot of emission of nitrogen and phosphorus to the river because we don't send the urine to the wastewater treatment plant. And that totally compensates the positive impact. So the balance is much lower than the actual practice. So also for eutrophication, urine-based fertilizer are much better than the using mineral fertilizers. So that's all for me. I've just taken something more concrete at the end. That's some picture of my garden where I use a bit of urine based on the recommendation of Renaud Delos that will do a presentation a bit later. And as you can see, it grows quite well. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Tristan. Great presentation. And in the interest of time, I'm just going to move us along to our last presenter, Umakant Badeti, whose presentation is titled Impact of Source Separation of Urine on Effluent Quality, Energy Consumption, and Greenhouse Gas Emissions of a Decentralized Wastewater Treatment Plant. Umakant is a PhD student at University of Technology, Sydney, in the School of Civil and Environmental Engineering. He has been working on source separation and nutrient recovery from urine and its effect on wastewater treatment plants as part of his PhD work. Welcome, and turning it over to you.
Hello, everyone. A very good morning, afternoon, and evening to all the audience attending this summit from all over the world in various time zones. My name is Umakant Badeti. I'm a PhD student at University of Technology, Sydney. It is certainly a pleasure to be here today, and I'll be presenting a part of my research work on impact of source separation of urine on effluent quality, energy consumption, and greenhouse gas emissions of a decentralized wastewater treatment plant. This is the outline for my today's presentation. I'll start with a bit of background on my research topic, followed by a case study that we performed in context to this, and some of the research gaps that we have targeted to address, followed by some of the findings that we have found in this case study, and finally concluding with acknowledgements. Let's get started by understanding the conventional nutrient cycle. The process of making chemical fertilizer involves extraction of nitrogen through fixation and phosphorus through rock mining. These processes, especially the nitrogen fixation process, has been found to be very energy intensive, and these nutrients help us in growing food crops and enter the human bodies through the food that we intake. Most of these nutrients leave the human body through our urine, and urine, along with the other wastewater sources, enters the wastewater treatment plant. And the wastewater treatment plant has an energy intensive process to remove the nitrogen back to air. And upon failing to meet the nutrient discharge limit, this can lead to waste and pollution. So when we look at this conventional nutrient cycle, it is broken or non-cyclic, energy intensive, which makes it unsustainable. In this regard, I would like to share an interesting fact that human urine produced from whole of Australia has sufficient nutrients to feed 20% of the total population. So what happens to this nutrient cycle when you divert urine? Instead of discharging, you divert, process, and use it back to grow crops. By doing this, closing the loop, reducing the chemical fertilizer demand, at the same time reducing waste and pollution. When we look at the contribution of urine to wastewater, it contributes to about 80% of the nitrogen and 55% of the phosphorus in wastewater. We'll try to understand the relevance of this in the later part of my presentation on the case study we performed. So we performed a case study on Sydney Central Park wastewater treatment plant. It is located in the basement of Central Park Mall, Sydney, Australia. It is an advanced and decentralized wastewater treatment plant comprising biological and membrane treatment process. And the treatment target of the plant is to produce wastewater of reusable quality. So this is a schematic of the treatment process at Central Park wastewater treatment plant. The treatment plant receives about 400 to 500 meter cube of wastewater per day from the apartment, shops, and offices in Central Park Mall. And the treatment process comprises of the conventional activated sludge process followed by MBR, UV, and RO process. So the treatment plant disposes its sludge wastage and RO brine into Sydney Water sewer pipeline. And Sydney Water charges the operator based on the the mass of nitrogen and phosphorus discharged into their pipeline. This is a contribution of urine and other wastewater sources that we talked about in one of the previous slides. And in a typical wastewater flow like Central Park, all these nutrients enter the wastewater treatment plant. And the typical specific treatment targets of the plant are to remove nitrogen, phosphorus, organics, and pathogens. However, the challenging parts of this process are nitrogen and phosphorus removal. Nitrogen removal at Center Park is done by the conventional nitrification and denitrification process. The challenging parts of this process are that it requires energy intensive aeration, which consumes about 40 to 60% of the total energy consumption. This process requires recirculation, which increases the space requirement of the plant, and about 0.4 to 4% of the influent nitrogen is released as nitrous oxide, which leads to global warming. So, one way to tackle this problem is by diverting urine, where you remove a major part of nitrogen and phosphorus from wastewater. And this process is expected to have an effect on the treatment process, like energy, greenhouse gas emissions, and treatment capacity. And this is the main focus of my research work. Commercial buildings like Centre Park in Australia are given star rating based on their water consumption, greenhouse gas emissions, and electricity consumption. Obtaining star rating is desirable because it provides government incentives. Hence, in order to reduce the water consumption, the idea of decentralized wastewater treatment plants is gaining popularity in Australia. However, an understanding on the effect of urine diversion on a decentralized setting like Central Park is missing, and this is the research gap that we were trying to address. We carried out this study using BioWin modeling platform, which is used by most of the water utilities in Australia. So we configured the model input was Centre Park wastewater treatment plant. We configured the treatment process in the plant on this platform, calibrated and validated this model, and the model output was to monitor these parameters. So we validated our modeling data first with real data from Central Park on MBR effluent quality and energy consumption, and our modeling results were within less than 10% error value. These are some of our model predictions on the impact of urine diversion so far. So we predict that about 33% of the current energy consumption can be reduced, mainly due to the reduction in aeration energy required for the nitrification process. The greenhouse gas emissions can also be reduced by 25%, mainly due to the reduction on the requirement of nitrification and denitrification process, which produce greenhouse gases. The nutrient discharge costs are also reduced by 23% because by diverting urine, you are recovering nutrients at the source, which avoids the need for these nutrients to be discharged in sludge wastage or RO brine, which ends up in Sydney water sewer pipeline. The treatment capacity of the plant is also increased by 200% because treatment capacity or the hydraulic retention time of the plant to meet the effluent nitrogen standards is dependent on the effluent nitrogen coming into the plant. And urine diversion significantly reduces the effluent nitrogen, which increases the current treatment capacity of the plant. To sum up, we could give the proof of concept that urine diversion can lead us towards efficient wastewater management in a decentralized setting like Central Park, and our group is also working towards process to efficiently recover nutrients from urine, which would lead us towards circular economy. I would like to acknowledge my supervisors and research team for their support, and Richard Institute for organizing this summit and giving me this opportunity to talk about my research. I would like to take this opportunity to share about a research grant that my co-supervisor, Professor Ho Kyung Chong, has won recently from Australian Research Council. This project is focused towards building confidence for a market in reusing urine as a fertilizer. If you are interested in collaborating or knowing more about this project, please feel free to contact Professor Ho Kyung Chong. And thank you all for your attention.
Thank you so much, Umakant. Excellent presentation. I'm going to bring our attention right now to a few of the questions that were in the chat that have not been addressed yet. Many of the questions, there's been a rich discussion in the chat, so many of the questions have been addressed. One question is, this is from Fernando Perez. Tristan, thanks for your presentation. Urine is not very high in phosphorus concentration. How did you balance the phosphorus requirement from wheat in the scenarios with urine-based fertilization?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, there is not enough phosphorus for wheat in conventional farming. So I think I'm looking at it, but a part of the phosphorus fertilization is done with mineral fertilizers. Even in the urine scenarios, there is a bit of phosphorus fertilizers.
Okay, thank you. And this is another question for Tristan from Abe Noyes. How did you select the NH3 volatilization rates for the different fertilizers, particularly the direct application of stored urine?
So we use some of the results that we have that we got in our field experiments, but we have done our field experiment in very favorable condition to fertilization, and so I think it was yes, maybe 20, we lose 20% of the nitrogen, and then we use a reduction factor, considering that we are that in our scenarios we will use the best available techniques to avoid ammonia volatilization, and that's how we calculate the emission factor in our scenario.
Thank you, Tristan.